Greetings and welcome. This is Mark Waterfield, the president and owner of PATC, and we really appreciate you being at the PATC podcast. Public Agency Training Council is the country's largest provider of seminars for law enforcement and fire departments. We have well over 120 classes and approximately 60 instructors. We also have virtual classes and pre-recorded webinars at patceducation.com, or you can sign up for our in-person classes at patc.com. And today's guest is my co-host, but also wearing the hat of being a guest as well, David Broadway. David, introduce yourself to our audience.
My name is David Broadway. To all of you out there, I'm a retired law enforcement officer, having worked on a local agency as a police officer in K-9. I was a detective, did some PR work for the PD. Then I went with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, where I retired, which is a large state agency in the state of Florida. During that period, I developed some areas of expertise, which I got to testify to in court. And now I'm an adjunct at Western Carolina University in the School of Criminology, as well as an adjunct for PATC.
Fantastic. You've done some really interesting projects. Can you tell our audience about the one-man play that you developed?
Well, the one-man play was developed during the pandemic, and needless to say, it didn't grow any legs during that period. So I took that opportunity to turn the soliloquy, a one-man play, into a book called 10-7, a memoir of reflection, humor, and gratitude. And it's selling some copies. It's on Amazon now.
Wonderful. Well, tell our audience about the book. What all is included there?
Well, in the book, I go into, I've always been fascinated with human relationships and human intelligence, what you can gather from people just by talking with them and gaining their trust and respect. And I thought back, and during my life, child, I came up through a turbulent time in an alcoholic, violent home, and it kind of stressed me for my law enforcement career. Nothing I saw really surprised, and also I had to interact with police because of things that was going on in my family as a young person. And then as I got out, I realized I had to hide some family secrets and things like that. I was a little bit afraid of people finding out. And that kind of segued into being able to communicate pretty well. And I'm very proud to say, Mark, during my tenure in law enforcement, we got officer evaluations and special agent evaluations. And a couple of years in a row, I got this. He has an uncanny ability to withdraw information from people. And I think that comes from purposeful communication, and which I parlayed into the course that I teach for PATC.
And what class is that?
That would be confidential sources, recruiting, managing, and documenting. And every step of the way is so critical in that process. However, to be a good recruiter of, for lack of a better term, domestic spies within our society that will feed law enforcement information that couldn't normally get. What I love about it is there's no advanced education, there's no advanced training required to become good at this. Because if you're skilled enough to have a significant other in your life, if you're skilled enough to have a core of good friends, you have the skills, you have what it takes to recruit criminal sources to assist law enforcement and also gain the confidence of a victim to talk to you. And I'm just really excited about that. And I have a story I love to tell about Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. Let me tell you that story. Mick Jagger, everybody knows, famous rocker for over 50 years now. He and Keith Richards, I think they've formaldehyde on them or something because they just keep going. But Mick Jagger had an interesting human interest story one time. And back when he was studying American blues in London, and he wasn't a wealthy person, he couldn't just travel to the U.S. to listen to Muddy Waters and B.B. King and some of the greats in the blues industry. He said, I've got to find a way to do this. And before all the technology was around, what Mick Jagger would do was he would take albums from Muddy Waters, Guitar Slim, and all the rest of the old blues artists, and he'd put them under his arm where people could see him, and he'd walk around a train station. He called it chat bait, and I use that in class all the time. If an old stoner can think of a way to make himself approachable where people want to talk to him, how much can law enforcement learn from him? Because he overcame an obstacle, because not everybody in London, England in the early 60s, late 50s were into blues music. music, didn't know who Muddy Waters was. And so Mick Jagger walking around with these albums, and I tell these guys, I said, okay, you've got a spouse, significant other? Yes. Do you ever notice somebody's shirt and say, hey, that's a conversation piece right there, or the shoes they wear, or a pen they have, or a regional accent? Anything can lead to a meaningful conversation. I try to make a connection with the criminal element. And I think I had the advantage, Mark, where I found the criminals and the bad guys kind of fascinating. And coming from a background of violence, oh, I can talk it with you. And sometimes I think I had to step up because of my background. When I came in, it's in the book that I was kind of pre-stressed, and I'd been around the bars since I was a kid, so communicating with people that were, some people would think were children of a lesser God. I found them fascinating. The people I worked with were interesting, loved them to death, but man, some of those bad guys were fascinating. And I could notice something about their shoes. I could notice something about the way they swaggered when they walked in the room to talk to me. And if I could look on the street, I would try to make associations. Who is the dominant on the street, and then who might be minimized? And I would go after, like a shark, I'd see blood in the water, somebody that was minimized on the street in the organization that I was investigating. And I might approach them after some study and say, hey, man, you're just not treated like the rest of these guys. You may want to switch sides. And I call that open water fishing. Most of us can do closed bond or barrel fishing, but the real skills of dealing with some of the underbelly of society is to go out there and recruit in what I call open water fishing. I just go up, I get them fascinated. I really drive home with the students that I have at the college as well as PATC that in communications, you're either interested or interesting. And in between is where the work happens. When they think that you're interested in what they have to say, and I call it in dynamic relationship cycle, what I call this is maintenance too, because if I'm talking to a bad guy always about business, well, it gets to be sterile communication. Whereas if I find out their sister's looking for a job, if I find out their mother has cancer, if I find out they have a brother in an out-of-state prison, and I always end and start an interview with a person I'm trying to glean information from is a personal or a individual, something that's individual to them and dear to them. That's a personal, emotional type of reaction to. And I'll say, hey, man, before we get going here, well, how's your mom doing? Did she get in that treatment? Did she get in on that clinical study for cancer treatments and things like that? And some people say, well, don't you feel a little icky, talking to those people? I said, no. And I said, when you really get good is when you really are interested. What happened with their mother? What happened with their brother? And then it makes a great transition into my objective. Once I get that out of the way, once I've ordered them a plate of food at a restaurant and we sit down, and then we get to the really nuts and bolts of my investigation. But it's all about that relationship. And Mick Jagger was so ahead of his time. And you think of him as a great artist. However, what a communicator he is. And the potential is endless out there. I can keep talking, Mark, but you can stop me. But it's a subject I love, and a subject I can't understand, that we are getting so sterile sometimes in society with our communication on smartphones and the computer. And we forget that, the body language, the microfacial expressions, when have I hit a nerve? When do I need to back off? And when do I need to move forward with the subject? And it's all about maintenance. I can identify an ideology of a person pretty easily. Some people identify with Baptists, Catholics, Hell's Angels, and cops. We were talking to a Hell's Angel in jail one time in Florida, and the interesting thing is nobody had contacted him for a while, and he was in there with a bunch of marauders and outlaws. That's not a good environment to be in. We hit on what I call a wiggle room. We knew his ideology. He was a gangster through and through. He's a one percenter. Then he hit on something. He said, I'll tell you one thing, Broadway. And I said, what's that? He said, gang is screwed up. It's going in the wrong direction. And ding, the light bulb came on. I said, really? Tell me more about that. And he goes, yeah, we used to be this and we used to be that. Now they're letting these people pledge to the angels. I'm going, dang, that is something. And we just got personal, he and I. And I said, I get what you're saying. And then I took baby steps. And I said, I'll tell you what, I can probably get you moved to another prison where life would be a little bit easier for you when you're not around a bunch of outlaws trying to kill you. And I said, but give me some room here to work with, because I have to show that you're worth the move. And he said, what do you mean? I said, let's start easy. Give me the history of the angels. Of course, Mark, I knew quite a bit of that history, but I said, give me the history of the angels. How did it get started? And what turned you a little sour more on their internal policies changing. And he lit up. He said, well, let me tell you about it. Back in the day when we were the original gangsters, OGs, life was good. But now we're letting Hispanics in there. Now we're letting African American. They're beginning to associate with the gang. And now I'm going to extort this. I'm just going to say, wow. And I'm going to become his most interested person. And I've always wanted to put together, this is something for you folks out there listening. I talk about recruiting on the outside, open water fishing. Recruiting in prisons is a untapped resource sometimes. The FBI does a little bit of it, and myself and a few of my partners did a lot of it. Every chance we got, we talked to somebody in prison because we were their living newspaper. They got all the sterile news in there, and then we found out that through the information we got, we knew who was visiting them, who was putting money in their canteen, and it was kind of like having a someone trapped. And I was there out to get some new information. So just loving people, but it's just like Baptist. People say, "Well, he's a Baptist." Well, there's primitive Baptist, there's Southern Baptist, and a lot of other Baptists. Catholics. I said, "What about Opus Dei?" Opus Dei is a sect of the Catholic Church, and I try to just really get in there and find the wiggle room. They're Catholic, but how do they feel about a trigger topic like abortion? How do they really feel about it? And then I exploit that to get in their head.
Well, let's talk to our audience about what type of criminal investigations do you use these techniques? I mean, I'm assuming drug investigations, but are there other investigations as well?
Absolutely. And some people are shocked to hear that. But of course, drugs come to mind because they have access to a culture you're trying to understand.
Yeah.
And they can talk the talk, and they know what a CD, if they're talking on the on a wire, and they say, man, those CDs didn't play right. And these people are telling me it's cocaine. They're talking about kilos of cocaine that they feel like they got screwed on. So we get into things like that. But after 9/11, I was put back into the JTTF, or after that was formed, because I had a background in the late 80s in terrorism, and they put me in there, and they said, can you recruit some of these people from target nations? I said, I think I can. I said, because I'm dealing with other cultures in the drug business and homicide and street gangs. So I got out there and I got to know some of the people at the universities from some target nations that we had interest in, that was in chemical engineering, which is a big thing. And I went by the mosque and introduced myself, and I asked them, can law enforcement be of any help to you? Kind of like reverse engineering. Can law enforcement be any help to you? Have you been discriminated against in our country? Because we're interested in in the impact and also how you feel about our country. In that, I got to work into some people that were in the convenience store business. I got to work into some people that were doing some things of structuring, putting monies in the bank. So terrorism, FBI and CIA has been doing it for years, of course. But on the local level, they said, Dave, can you do anything at the university, the mosque around here? I said, I sure think I can. And I documented several sources from countries that were of a concern on a terrorist nexus. Got a lot of attaboys and some reviews and letters, and I appreciated that because I was working with the FBI, working with immigration, which now, of course, is ICE. Got to lead them to some money being exchanged in some strange ways over in Egypt. And I was very proud of that. And Mark, it all came down to relationships, sitting down and drinking some god awful hot tea that I didn't really care for, but my face never gave it away. And so I think any crime that you're looking at, sources, and I just can't believe that law enforcement in a lot of areas haven't caught on to this. Fraud, sources, fraud, the banking industry to go with the sources, drugs, of course, and terrorism. I'm a big believer that we have sleeper cells in this country that have given up the ghost. They're going, wait a minute, they've kind of cut my communications. I'm not getting the everyday message I need, and I'm not getting any money. Well, what more fertile ground do you have that once a terrorist individual gets in this country and he's here to do us harm, but we've cut some communications to him, and now he's floundering in the water, and you get to go and get into his head in that wiggle room in his ideology and say, wait a minute, the American devils have not stopped you from going to the mosque. We don't want you blowing up our stuff, but can't you go and practice your religion in any way you want? And some of their eyes light up and say, this guy's got it. He understands. I just want to praise Allah. I said, I'm all with you, and sometimes I went home to my wife, Lynn, and I tell her, not who was the interview, but I tell her a little bit about the interviews. And she said, well, weren't you kind of lying? I said, my interest wasn't lying. I was very interested in what they had to say, because the next time I have a communications with that person, I'm going to ask him how his visa is going, how his mother is trying to get his mother into this country and things like that. And he's going to look at me like I'm the second coming, because this person cares about me. And maybe I do. And I will tell you this, people out there, call me anything you want, but 34 years starting in 1974, I put some people in jail that I really liked over the years. And I had to shelf my emotions and go with the state statute or the federal code to put that person in jail because of genuine, unsterile communication. I wasn't stiff. I was interested. I leaned forward. I used the correct facial expressions, and I was able to extract things that some people couldn't. And they said, "You've really talked to a Hell's Angel?" I said, "He talks to me," and we have a good time at it. So I don't know if you have any other questions, Mark, because if not, my enthusiasm will carry it.
Yes, there's no doubt about that. You're very enthusiastic, and we really appreciate the opportunity to have you affiliated with PATC. If a typical police officer in a small to medium-sized department were to consider taking your class, what might you tell them to convince them that this is a tool that they need?
Oh, I loved that question. I really do. I think you and I talked about where I am in North Carolina now that I'm retired. I'm about 40 something miles from Johnson City, Tennessee. And I would get a historical with that young officer. I'd say, did you know one of the most notorious outlaws in organized crime history, Al Capone, frequented Johnson City, Tennessee? And I said, he had an entourage. He had people that felt minimized at some time. He had people working around him says, uh-oh, I'm next to get shot. I've been disloyal. And if the officers in Johnson City, Tennessee, and the reason, let me put it in perspective, Johnson City, Tennessee was about the halfway mark from Chicago to Miami. So he would stop off there to speakeasies and such as that. And I was thinking, man, what if a local officer would have been really attuned to his environment and saying, who is this guy in spats getting off the train and saying, he's important because he's got an entourage. And if they pay attention, every chain has a weak link. Every chain has a link. And to identify someone close to Al Capone and to exploit that and to gain information, taking baby steps to know that communications, I tell some people that, everybody wants a microwave solution to a crock pot problem. It's a slow cook sometimes, and I might not see this guy. And a short story now that I've told you about the Tennessee thing would be we have a fishing village in North Florida that's not very law enforcement friendly. And a lot of things were going on there, of course, smuggling. And there was a guy in the courthouse, and I was coming through dressed up kind of dapper in a suit that day from a deposition. And I'm walking through, and I see this old fisherman leaning against a wall, and he's got papers, and he's looking and squinting and scratching his head. And I stopped and I said, hey, man, can I take a look at that? Because opportunity knocks. I knew he was a local by the way he was dressed. I knew he was local by his leathered skin from oystering and things off the coast. So I stopped and said, hey, man, can I see those papers a minute? He said, you a lawyer or something? I said, I'm something. I said, give me the papers. Let me look. And so I looked at it and I said, do you know what you're looking at here? And he said, no. I said, this is a restraining order. I said, who's Llewellyn? That's my woman. I said, did you guys have something going on lately? And he goes, well, we got into a fight. She hit me and then I hit her. And I said, this is a restraining order. I said, let me explain a restraining order to you. Nobody had ever done that. So I told him, I said, now this date, you must appear in court. She must appear. If you don't appear, this restraining order goes away. If not, he said, well, she hit me first and used some explicits there. And I said, it doesn't matter. It's a restraining order. I said, hear me out. Do you think you could take this paper and stay away until this date and see if she goes to trial? And it may be all over and y'all can move back in and smooch it up again. And he goes, yeah, I can do that. I said, all right, well, here you go, brother. And I handed him his papers back. And he said, well, who are you? And I pulled out a business card. I said, I'm a special agent with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. But I said, I was concerned. You look like you were in despair over here. And I just wanted to talk to you a minute. 2 years passed. I said, if you know of anything going on around here that's got you in an ire or things things that maybe you would like to earn some money on telling me about. I said, you give me a call and we'll have another conversation. Almost 2 years later, I didn't hear from him for almost 2 years. And then somebody did him wrong. And he called me up and the floodgates opened. And my supervisor said, how in the heck did you come across this guy? I said, chat bait.
Yeah.
He had, back to Mick Jagger, I said, he had something in his hand that was of great interest to him. And I took advantage of that. And he said, we're going to work a smuggling case, aren't we? And I said, yes, we are. I said, we're probably going to uncover some bodies. And here's where you go, Mark, with, all right, narcotics is famous for having confidential sources, which I don't call informants because they're really one of the most important things that I did was cultivate information, intelligence. My confidential source will get me into there. I've even heard him say, "Were you interested in an old murder?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'm interested in that." And so you see how that goes around. Somebody that's in stolen property because thugs do thug stuff. Thugs know other thugs, and thugs like using drugs. So I was feeding information to the fraud squad. I was feeding information to the violent crime squad, and I was in there with my main crux being dope. Now I also developed sources within those squads because they said, Broadway did me a solid. If I come across something that he's working, I need to go ahead and give him a call, not take the credit for it, but give him a call and let him take a credit because he just fluffed me up.
Well, that's great. I'm sure that your class is very, very enjoyable. I know we get high marks from it, and we really appreciate our relationship with you. I know that you're an extraordinary instructor. Thank you very much for appearing on this episode of the podcast.
It was a pleasure, Mark.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at phtcpodcast1@gmail.com.
1